The room was spinning again by the time I made it to the bathroom, my hand dragging along the hallway wall like I was 70 years old instead of 34. And when I finally gripped the edge of the sink and looked up at my own reflection, I did not recognize the woman staring back at me, pale, hollow-eyed, swaying slightly even while standing still. Weston's voice drifted up the stairs, warm and syrupy as always. "Rest, darling, I'll handle dinner." And something about the way he said it that night, the third time that week I had felt dizzy right after eating, made my stomach twist in a way that had nothing to do with nausea. I splashed cold water on my face and told myself it was stress. The wedding planning, the new job, anything but the truth that was already knocking quietly at the back of my mind. Because 6 months earlier, this man had gotten down on one knee in front of my entire family and promised to spend the rest of his life taking care of me, and now I was starting to wonder what exactly that meant to him. That night, after he brought up a tray with soup I barely touched and a glass of wine I let go flat on the nightstand, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning in slow, hypnotic circles, and I made a decision that would end up unraveling everything I thought I knew about the man I was supposed to marry. My name is Odessa Marsh, and until that spring I would have told you I was the luckiest woman in Charleston, South Carolina. I ran a small interior design studio out of a converted carriage house on Broad Street, the kind of business that survived on referrals and word of mouth, and I had built it slowly over 8 years after leaving a corporate job that drained more than it gave. I was not looking for love when I met Weston Calloway. In fact, I had sworn off dating apps and blind setups after a string of disappointments that left me more interested in fabric swatches than first dates. But Weston did not come from an app. He came into my studio on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October, dripping from the storm outside, asking if I could help him pick out furnishings for a rental property he had just closed on. He was charming in a way that felt effortless rather than practiced, tall with sandy brown hair going gray at the temples, a real estate investor who had made his money flipping historic homes across the Lowcountry. He laughed easily. He remembered small details, the name of my dog, the fact that I took my coffee with oat milk, the anniversary of my father's passing, which I had only mentioned once in an offhand comment. Within 3 months, we were inseparable. Within 8, he proposed on the beach at Sullivan's Island at sunset, and I said yes before he even finished the question. Because for the first time in my adult life, I felt like someone was actually paying attention to me, actually building a life around me instead of expecting me to build mine around them. Looking back now, I understand that the qualities I once found so endearing, the way he remembered everything about me, the way he seemed to anticipate my needs before I voiced them, were the same qualities that should have worried me from the start. A man who studies you that closely is not always doing it out of love. Sometimes he is doing it because he is looking for weaknesses. But hindsight has a cruelty to it that foresight never offers, and back then, all I saw was devotion. Weston moved into my house on Trad Street about 4 months before the wedding, a decision that made sense financially since his rental properties were all investment units, and he had been living out of a downtown condo he rarely used. He was the one who suggested it, actually, framing it as practical. Why pay for 2 households when we're about to be one? And I remember feeling grateful that he was thinking ahead, planning our future with the same precision he applied to his real estate deals. What I did not realize was that moving in also meant he had access to every room in my house, every cabinet, every drawer, every part of my daily routine, including my kitchen. The cooking started innocently enough. Weston had always enjoyed cooking. He told me stories about learning from his grandmother in Savannah, about Sunday dinners that stretched for hours, and in the early days of our relationship, he would surprise me with elaborate meals maybe once or twice a month, a way of showing off, a way of impressing me. After he moved in, though, the frequency increased. First, it was 3 nights a week. Then it was every night. Then he began insisting I not even step foot in the kitchen while he worked, gently steering me toward the living room with a glass of wine and instructions to relax after a long day at the studio. "You take care of everyone else all day," he would say, kissing my forehead. "Let me take care of you for once." I remember telling my sister Priyanka about it over the phone, laughing about how spoiled I was becoming, how I be. Barely remembered the last time I had cooked my own breakfast, let alone dinner. She had laughed too, said I was lucky, said her husband could barely operate a toaster. Neither of us thought anything more of it. Why would we? A man who cooks for his fiancé every night sounds like a blessing, not a warning sign. The dizziness started slowly enough that I did not connect it to anything at first. A slight lightheadedness after dinner that I chalked up to low blood sugar or dehydration. Then it became more pronounced, a heaviness behind my eyes, a strange metallic taste that lingered in my mouth for an hour or so after meals, a fatigue so deep that some nights I could barely make it up the stairs before collapsing into bed at 8:30, sometimes even earlier. I mentioned it to my doctor during a routine checkup in late March, and she ran a basic panel of blood work that came back mostly normal, aside from slightly elevated liver enzymes that she said could be caused by any number of benign factors: stress, alcohol, medication interactions. She told me to keep an eye on it and come back if the symptoms worsened. I did not think to mention that the dizziness always seemed to hit hardest after dinner, specifically after the meals Weston prepared, because at that point in my life, it had not yet occurred to me that the person cooking for me every single night might be the source of my declining health rather than the solution to my stress. It was my best friend Marisol who first planted the seed of doubt, though she did not mean to do it directly. We were having lunch at a cafe near the market, and I was describing my symptoms, half complaining, half joking about feeling like an old woman before my time, when she went quiet in a way that was uncharacteristic of her usually talkative nature. "Odessa," she said carefully, setting down her fork, "does this only happen at home? Like, does it happen when you eat lunch with me, or when you're traveling for work?" I sat there for a moment, genuinely trying to remember, and the answer, when it came to me, sent a chill down my spine despite the warm April sun streaming through the cafe windows. No, it never happened at lunch with her. It never happened on the 2 work trips I had taken to Atlanta that spring. It only happened at home, in the evenings, after dinner, after meals Weston had prepared with what I had always assumed was love. Marisol did not say anything more that day. She could see the color draining from my face and quickly changed the subject to something lighter, but the seed had been planted, and over the following 2 weeks, I found myself watching Weston in the kitchen with a scrutiny I had never applied before, noticing things I had somehow managed not to notice for months. I noticed that he always insisted on plating the food himself, even when I offered to help, waving me off with some excuse about presentation or timing. I noticed that he kept a small collection of imported oils and spices on a shelf above the stove that he was oddly protective of, joking once when I reached for a bottle that it was too expensive to waste on someone who won't appreciate the difference. I noticed that on the nights he seemed most insistent about cooking, the nights he practically pushed me out of the kitchen with wine glass in hand, my symptoms afterward were always the worst. And I noticed, though it took me embarrassingly long to put together, that Weston himself never seemed to eat quite as much as I did during those dinners, always claiming he had snacked while cooking, always leaving significant portions of his own plate untouched while somehow encouraging me, gently but persistently, to finish mine. "You need your strength," he would say, refilling my wine glass before I had even finished it. "You've been working so hard lately." I began to understand, with a dawning horror that took my breath away in the middle of ordinary afternoons, that the man I was set to marry in 6 weeks might be doing something to my food. I did not confront him. I want to be clear about that because so many people, when I later told this story, asked why I did not simply ask him directly, why I did not demand an explanation the moment suspicion crossed my mind. The truth is that a lifetime of being told I was too sensitive, too paranoid, too dramatic, by exes, by family members, by well-meaning friends who thought they were helping, had trained me to doubt my own instincts before I doubted anyone else's intentions. I needed proof before I could even trust my own gut, let alone confront a man I had planned to spend the rest of my life with. So instead, I started paying closer attention, quietly, carefully, the way you learn to move through a house you suspect might not be as safe as you once believed. The turning point came on a Thursday evening in early May, about 3 weeks before the dizziness had first started becoming a pattern I could no longer ignore. Weston had an unexpected work call that pulled him out to his car in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes, something about a contractor dispute on one of his flip properties, and I found myself alone in the kitchen for the first time in months with nothing to do but wait. I do not know exactly what compelled me to open the cabinet under the sink. It was not a place I normally had reason to look, since that was where we kept dish soap, extra sponges, cleaning supplies, the mundane machinery of household maintenance that no one thinks twice about. But something pulled me toward it that evening, some instinct I could not name, and when I crouched down and pushed aside a stack of folded dish towels, I found a small wooden box tucked behind the pipe. The kind of box you might use to store jewelry or cufflinks, dark walnut with a tiny brass clasp. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, was a glass dropper bottle, the kind you might see in an old-fashioned apothecary, amber-colored so the contents could not easily be seen against light. There was no label. No pharmacy sticker, no handwritten note, nothing to indicate what it contained or why it was hidden, quite deliberately it seemed, behind the plumbing under my kitchen sink, rather than in any of the more obvious and accessible places a person might store a supplement or medication. I picked it up and held it to the kitchen light, and I could see a faint amber liquid sloshing inside, maybe a third full, as though it had been used regularly over a period of weeks. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my own ears. I heard the front door open, heard Weston's footsteps in the hallway, and in a panic, I shoved the bottle back into its box and slid it back behind the pipe, closing the cabinet just as he walked into the kitchen, phone still pressed to his ear, giving me an absent smile before turning back toward the living room to finish his call. I did not sleep at all that night. I lay next to him, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the warmth radiating off his body, the way I had felt comforted by for the past 18 months, and now feeling nothing but a cold, creeping dread that made my skin crawl every time his arm shifted toward me in his sleep. The next morning, after he left for a site visit at one of his properties, I went straight back to the cabinet under the sink. This time, I did not put the bottle back. I wrapped it carefully in a plastic bag, placed it in my purse, and drove directly to a private toxicology lab I found after a frantic search online, a facility that specialized in discreet, confidential testing for individuals, not just hospitals and law enforcement. I remember sitting in the parking lot for almost 10 minutes before I could bring myself to walk inside, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel, asking myself over and over whether I was overreacting, whether I was about to embarrass myself over what might turn out to be nothing more than an old bottle of essential oil or a discontinued cologne sample. Part of me wanted desperately to be wrong. Part of me hoped the technician would take one sniff and laugh, hand it back, and tell me to go home and stop watching so many crime documentaries. The woman at the front desk, a soft-spoken technician named Renata, took the bottle without judgment, explained the process, told me results for a basic composition panel would take 3 to 5 business days, longer if they needed to send it out for more specialized analysis. I paid in cash. I do not know why that detail mattered to me so much at the time, but something in me did not want a paper trail leading back to my own home. As though some part of me already understood, I was standing at the edge of something that might require careful documentation and careful protection of my own safety before this was over. The 5 days that followed were some of the longest of my life. I went through the motions of wedding planning, met with the florist about centerpieces, approved the final proof of our invitation suite, all while carrying a secret so heavy it felt physically present in my chest, a stone lodged somewhere between my ribs that made it hard to breathe normally. I watched Weston cook dinner every night that week with a kind of detached horror I had never experienced before, smiling and nodding at his stories about his day while internally cataloging every gesture. Every moment his back was turned toward the stove. Every time he reached for that shelf of expensive oils and spices he had once warned me not to touch. I stopped eating the meals he prepared, at first quietly, pushing food around my plate and claiming a nervous stomach from wedding stress, then more elaborately, telling him I had started a new eating plan recommended by my doctor that involved smaller, simpler meals I would prepare myself. He seemed surprised by this, even slightly wounded, asking more than once if he had done some. Thing wrong if I was upset with him about something. I told him no, that I loved him, that I just wanted to feel healthier before the wedding. Every word felt like ash in my mouth. Within 4 days of cutting his cooking out of my diet entirely, the dizziness stopped. Completely. The metallic taste disappeared. The bone-deep fatigue that had been dragging me down for weeks lifted so gradually, I almost did not notice it was gone until I found myself staying up past 10 o'clock one evening, reading a novel in bed, feeling more like myself than I had in over a month. That, more than anything else, told me everything I needed to know before the lab results even came back. But I still needed proof, real proof, something undeniable, because I knew that if I was going to end this engagement, if I was going to protect myself and potentially involve the police, I could not simply rely on a feeling, however strong that feeling had become. The call from the lab came on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at the studio, fabric samples spread across my work table for a client meeting scheduled that evening. Renata's voice was measured, professional, but there was something underneath it, a note of concern that made my stomach drop before she even finished her first sentence. She explained that the substance in the bottle was a compounded mixture, not something you could pick up over the counter, containing a sedative typically prescribed for short-term anxiety and sleep disorders, combined with a secondary agent that, in the concentrations they detected, could cause exactly the symptoms I had described: dizziness, fatigue, a metallic taste, elevated liver markers with prolonged use. She was careful to say that she could not speak to intent, that her job was simply to identify composition, but she strongly recommended I contact both my physician and, given the circumstances I had described to her during our initial conversation, local law enforcement. I sat in my studio for a long time after that call, staring at the fabric samples without really seeing them, feeling something inside me that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but some combustible mixture of both. 18 months. He had spent 18 months building a version of himself designed specifically to appeal to me, learning my habits, memorizing my preferences, positioning himself as the caretaker, the provider, the man who would handle dinner so I could rest. And somewhere in that carefully constructed performance, he had decided that the version of Odessa Marsh he wanted to marry was one who was dependent, foggy, perhaps easier to control, or perhaps. And this was the thought that truly turned my blood cold. One who might eventually become sick enough to require the kind of care that would give him access to something even more valuable than my trust. I called Marisol first, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone twice while dialing. She came to the studio within 20 minutes, and I told her everything: the bottle, the lab results, the pattern I had finally allowed myself to see clearly. She did not tell me I was overreacting. She did not suggest I give him the benefit of the doubt. She simply put her arms around me and said, "We need to call the police, and we need to do it before you go back to that house tonight." Her certainty gave me the courage I needed. Together, we drove to the Charleston Police Department, and I filed a report, handing over the lab documentation, explaining the timeline of my symptoms, describing exactly where and how I had found the bottle. The detective who took my statement, a patient, thorough woman named Detective Yolanda Briggs, explained that they would need to investigate further before any charges could be filed, that they would likely want to test additional samples from my home, possibly interview Weston, possibly obtain a warrant depending on what they found. She also told me something that I had not fully considered until that moment, gently but directly. That in cases like this, motive often mattered as much as method, and that they would be looking closely at our financial situation, our life insurance policies, any changes Weston might have made to beneficiary designations or estate planning documents in recent months. That detail hit me harder than almost anything else that day. 3 months earlier, at Weston's insistence, framed as responsible pre-wedding planning, we had both taken out substantial life insurance policies, naming each other as primary beneficiaries. At the time it had seemed practical, even romantic in its own way, a sign that he was thinking seriously about our shared future, about protecting me if anything ever happened to him. Now, sitting in that sterile interview room with Detective Briggs, I felt sick as I recalled how insistent he had been about the specific amount, pushing for a policy nearly double what our financial advisor had originally recommended, arguing that was better to be overprepared than underprepared. I had thought I was marrying a man who wanted to protect me. I was beginning to understand I might have been living with a man who was patiently, methodically, preparing to profit from my decline. Detective Briggs also asked me a question that afternoon that I did not expect. one that took me several days to answer honestly even to myself. She asked whether, looking back, there had been moments when Weston seemed disappointed that I was feeling better, small flickers of frustration on mornings when I woke up clear-headed and energetic instead of foggy and slow. I sat with that question for a long time after I left the station, replaying dozens of ordinary mornings in my mind. And I realized, with a sick jolt of recognition, that yes, there had been such moments. Mornings when I bounded down the stairs ready to go for a run before work and Weston's face had tightened almost imperceptibly. Mornings when he had suggested, a little too quickly, that I might want to take it easy instead, that I looked tired even when I felt perfectly fine. I had always read those moments as concern. Now I understood them as something closer to disappointment, the quiet frustration of a man watching his careful work undone by nothing more than a good night's sleep. I did not go home that night. I stayed with Marisol, and over the following week, while I coordinated with Detective Briggs and started the painful process of contacting a divorce and family law attorney to at least begin untangling myself from the engagement even before any criminal case moved forward, the investigation quietly gathered momentum. Detective Briggs obtained a warrant to search the house on Trad Street, and what they found there confirmed my worst fears while also revealing layers of premeditation I had never imagined possible. In addition to the dropper bottle I had already turned over, they found a second, nearly identical bottle hidden in a different location, this one behind a false panel in the garage, along with a small notebook, water-damaged in one corner but still largely legible, where Weston had apparently been tracking something in a code I did not initially understand. Detective Briggs later explained that forensic accountants working with the investigation believed the notebook contained a log of dates, small numeric entries that appeared to correlate almost exactly with the nights he had insisted on cooking, alongside separate notes referencing our insurance paperwork, and more chillingly, notes about a rental property in North Carolina that records showed he had begun quietly transferring into a shell company registered only in his name over the previous 4 months. The picture that emerged over the following weeks was worse than anything I could have imagined sitting in that cafe with Marisol just weeks earlier. Weston was not simply a controlling partner who wanted me sedated and compliant, though that alone would have been horrific enough. Detective Briggs explained, during a follow-up meeting at the station, that the pattern investigators were seeing suggested a longer-term plan, one designed to slowly compromise my physical health over a period of months, potentially leading toward a medical crisis that would appear, to any outside observer, entirely natural, especially once the marriage was finalized and the increased life insurance payout became active. It was Detective Briggs who first said the word that made the entire nightmare snap into horrifying focus. "We believe," she said carefully, watching my face for a reaction, "that this may not have been about control. We believe it may have escalated toward something far more permanent, timed around your wedding date and the insurance policy's incontestability period." I remember the room tilting slightly around me, though this time it had nothing to do with any substance in my system, and everything to do with the sheer scale of the betrayal I was being asked to absorb in real time. Weston was arrested 11 days after I found the bottle under the sink, at one of his rental properties, where he had apparently gone to meet with a contractor, as though his entire life had not just collapsed around him. He was charged initially with poisoning, a felony offense in South Carolina, and additional charges related to financial fraud followed once forensic accountants finished tracing the property transfers and the falsified documents he had used to open the shell company. When the news broke locally, first through court records and then, inevitably, through a local news segment that picked up the story given Weston's relative visibility in the Charleston real estate community, I remember feeling a strange, disorienting mixture of vindication and violation, as though my private nightmare had become public property overnight. Colleagues I barely knew reached out with messages of support. A few acquaintances, people who had attended our engagement party just months earlier, distanced themselves awkwardly, unsure how to process the fact that the charming man who had toasted our future that evening was now facing the possibility of decades in prison. The weeks following the arrest were some of the hardest of my entire life, harder in some ways than the discovery itself. because the initial adrenaline of fear and investigation gave way to a slower, more exhausting grief. The grief of realizing that an entire relationship, every tender moment, every late-night conversation, every small gesture I had once treasured, had to be recontextualized through the lens of calculation rather than love. I spent hours with a therapist trying to untangle which memories, if any, had been real. Whether there had ever been a version of Weston Calloway who genuinely cared for me, or whether I had simply been a carefully selected target from the very beginning, a woman with a stable business, a paid-off house, and, crucially, a large enough life insurance policy to make the long con worthwhile. My therapist, a calm and steady woman named Dr. Ackhaffer, told me something during one of our early sessions that I have carried with me ever since. That I did not need to solve the puzzle of his sincerity in order to heal, that my safety and my recovery did not depend on ever fully understanding what, if anything, he had actually felt for me. The criminal case moved slowly, as these things often do, stretching across the better part of a year with preliminary hearings, evidence disclosures, and the kind of legal maneuvering that made me grateful, more than once, for Detective Briggs's patience in walking me through each stage. During that year, I threw myself back into my studio work, taking on projects that demanded my full attention, restoring old Charleston homes room by room in a way that felt, without my fully realizing it at first, like a metaphor for what I was doing to my own life. I moved out of the Trad Street house temporarily while the investigation concluded, staying with Marisol, and then eventually finding a small rental of my own near the water, a space that belonged entirely to me, free of any trace of Weston Calloway, free of hidden cabinets and locked wooden boxes and the low, creeping dread that had once lived alongside me in every room of my own home. Amanda Reyes, a woman who had briefly dated Weston nearly 4 years earlier, before I had ever met him, reached out to me through a mutual acquaintance about 6 months into the investigation, after seeing a small mention of the case in a regional newspaper. Over coffee, in a conversation that left me shaking for hours afterward, she described a strikingly similar pattern from her own relationship with him, dizziness she had never been able to explain, a sudden and unexplained illness that had hospitalized her for nearly a week before she ended things with him, attributing her recovery at the time to simply getting away from a stressful relationship, rather than considering the possibility that something more sinister had been happening in her own kitchen. She had never reported it, she told me, because at the time she had no proof, no bottle, no lab results, nothing but a lingering unease she had eventually convinced herself was paranoia. Her testimony, once she agreed to speak with Detective Briggs, became a crucial piece of the prosecution's case, establishing a pattern of behavior that made it far harder for Weston's defense attorney to argue that my discovery under the kitchen sink had been some isolated, easily explained anomaly. The trial itself lasted just under 3 weeks. I testified for nearly a full day, walking the jury through every detail, the dizziness, the metallic taste, the way Weston had insisted on cooking every single meal, the moment I found the wooden box behind the pipes under my sink, the decision to have the contents tested rather than confront him directly. I watched him during my testimony, sitting beside his attorney in an ill-fitting gray suit that seemed to have been chosen specifically to make him look smaller, less threatening than the man I remembered standing in our kitchen with a wine glass in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other. He did not look at me the entire time I spoke. I do not know if that was strategic advice from his attorney or simple cowardice, but either way, I found a strange kind of peace in it, as though his refusal to meet my eyes confirmed something I needed to understand, that whatever power he had once held over my sense of safety and reality had finally, completely, drained away. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on the poisoning charge and 2 related fraud counts connected to the falsified insurance paperwork and the shell company transfers. Weston was ultimately sentenced to 14 years, with the judge specifically citing the calculated, methodical nature of the crime, the fact that it had been carried out over an extended period against a partner who trusted him completely, as an aggravating factor in her sentencing decision. When the verdict was read, I did not feel the explosive sense of triumph I had once imagined I might feel in that moment. back when the investigation was young and my rage was still sharp and immediate. Instead, I felt something quieter, a kind of exhausted relief, the sense of finally being able to exhale after holding my breath for the better part of 2 years. In the months that followed the trial, I sold the house on Trad Street. I could not imagine ever feeling at peace in those rooms again, no matter how thoroughly I cleaned or renovated them, no matter how many times I told myself that the danger had passed. I used part of the proceeds to expand my studio, finally hiring the second designer I had been putting off bringing on for years, and I used another portion to establish a small fund, working with a local women's shelter, to help survivors of domestic abuse and coercive control access independent toxicology testing and legal resources when they suspected something was wrong but lacked the financial means to investigate those suspicions on their own. It felt important to me that something useful come out of what had happened, that the fear and vigilance I had been forced to develop in my own kitchen might spare even one other woman from spending months doubting her own instincts the way I had. Amanda Reyes and I stayed in touch after the trial, an unlikely friendship born out of a shared trauma that neither of us would have wished on anyone else. We talk sometimes about the strange, quiet ways abuse can disguise itself as devotion, about how the very qualities that once made Weston seem like a dream partner, his attentiveness, his eagerness to take care of every detail, his insistence on handling things so we would not have to, were the same qualities that allowed him to slip a compounded sedative into our food for months without either of us suspecting a thing. She told me once, over coffee on the anniversary of my discovery, that she used to believe love meant letting someone take care of everything for you. Now, she said, she believes real love means a partner who wants you strong and clear-headed and fully present, not one who needs you dependent, foggy, and grateful for scraps of attention doled out between carefully measured doses. I think about that conversation often, especially now, nearly 2 years removed from the night I first felt that unfamiliar dizziness creeping through my body, while Weston's voice drifted up the stairs telling me to rest, to let him handle dinner. I am not with anyone right now, and I am, for the first time in a long while, completely at peace with that. I cook my own meals again, simple ones mostly, nothing fancy, but every bite belongs entirely to me, chosen and prepared by my own hands, and there is a kind of quiet freedom in that ritual I never expected to find so meaningful. Some nights I still catch myself checking cabinets I have no real reason to check. A small, lingering habit from a year I would not wish on anyone, but even that vigilance feels different now. Less like fear and more like a promise I made to myself in that Charleston Police Department interview room, a promise to never again mistake control for care or convenience for love. People sometimes ask me whether I regret staying quiet as long as I did before searching that cabinet under the sink, whether I wish I had trusted my instincts sooner, back when the dizziness first started, back when a small voice in the back of my mind first began whispering that something was wrong. I used to carry guilt over that hesitation. Now I understand that the delay was never a failure of intelligence or strength. It was simply what happens when someone you love spends 18 months carefully, deliberately teaching you not to trust yourself. The real strength, I have come to believe, was not in noticing sooner. It was in finally listening to that quiet voice at all, in walking into that lab with shaking hands and a stranger's careful reassurance, in choosing proof over doubt, and in refusing, ultimately, to let a wooden box hidden behind a kitchen pipe remain a secret that could have cost me everything. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you had noticed the same pattern Odessa did? Would you have searched the kitchen the moment suspicion first crossed your mind, or would it have taken you longer to trust your own instincts the way it took her? Share your perspective in the comments below, and if you enjoy thoughtful stories about betrayal, resilience, and the courage it takes to reclaim your own life, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.